Okay, so welcome back. Today we're going to cover RESTful APIs, specifically the Github API and parsing JSON. So like last time, we're going to be covering a lot of material, and when it comes to RESTful APIs, we're really just going to be skimming the surface. So I highly recommend going through the API chapter in the second Real Python course, which covers RESTful APIs in much greater detail, and it includes a number of fun practice problems. So with that, let's go and get started. I'm going to hop back into the chat real quick. Cool. Somebody gave me the good to go. All right. So if you missed it, again, I don't know why I'm black and white. I had this fixed before. My life is not monochromatic. It is in colors. Or it is in color, so didn't want you to think that. All right, let me go ahead and do a screen share. Okay, so as always, let's hop into the terminal. Go ahead and activate your virtual environment. And let me just zoom in on this. Actually, remember this time. Okay, so let's talk about RESTful APIs real quick. So I guess put simply, RESTful APIs provide access to data from structured URLs using the HTTP methods get, post, put, and delete. So you've seen both get and post requests in our current application, which are actually the most common requests that you'll see. So let's go ahead and fire up the server. So Python app.py. And then within your Chrome developer tools, then go to your network tab. Now let's just refresh this. So you can see the actual request here, and you can click on it here. And if we scroll down here, there we go. So we can see it's a GET request, and you can see that we are hitting this endpoint here, this localhost 5000. So basically what happened, Flask handled this request by just rendering our index.html template. So in the case of a post request, let me just clear this out. So in the case of a post request, let's just put 2 and 3 in here. When we submit this, is going to get handled by Ajax and our JavaScript file. And let me hit submit. So here's the actual request. Click view source there. So you can see it's a post request. It's hitting that same endpoint. And so Flask in turn took that data we sent, so 2 and 3, and then performed an operation on it, which summed the two numbers and then returned that sum number. So these are just basic examples of get and post requests. Another example is this placepuppy.it. And you can just basically simply add the dimensions that you want for a picture at the end of a URL. And then you can send a GET request that URL and you get a random picture back. So you can say like 200 by 300 and you'll get a nice cute picture back. Or you can do 500. Again, this is just another basic example of a GET request. Okay, so for interacting with a RESTful API, you just need to know the URL endpoint, which requests you can perform, so that's get, post, put, or delete, and then how to structure the request. So we've covered the first two, and now we can turn to the GitHub API to look at the latter point. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so I do urge you to consult the Real Python course for more information. At the very least, you can check out this blog post here. This is on the Django REST framework, but this details how to structure a RESTful API at the very beginning here. So it's definitely really good to check out. Okay, so if you go to developer.github.com, we can take a look at the documentation here. So you always want to start with the documentation when working with an API. And fortunately, GitHub has some really well-written docs, which unfortunately is not the norm. So in a lot of cases, developers spend a ton of time designing and structuring an API and barely any time at all in the docs. So again, we can go to developer.github.com and then you can click API. So there's a number of things you should check out even before you look at the type of data that you can consume. So you want to start by looking at the version number of the API. And you can see here that the version right now, the current version is version 3. And then you also want to see if you need to be authenticated to access the API. This simply means that you may have to register with the service provider, so GitHub in this case, to obtain credentials, and these are often called API keys or tokens, to access the API. And in many cases, you don't have to register, but you only get limited access to the API, which is the case for this GitHub API, and we'll talk more about that shortly. So for now, let's go ahead and figure out the data that we want to obtain or consume from this API. So if we go back to our application that we're creating, and let's just type in a city here. So how about San Francisco? So basically, we want to obtain metadata about a GitHub user. So this is the, looks like this, that's the username. That's obviously their avatar, picture, where they're from, blah, blah, blah. So if we go back to the documentation here, on the right side over here, this is how the API, this shows the logical organization of the API. And so if you were doing this on your own, you would just need to pick a category and see if you can determine the overall structure of the API. Now, for time's sake, I already know that we can use the search category to get what we want. So if we click search, so right off the bat here, we can see this rate limit. That's the ramifications of not being logged in or authenticated. So if you see here, for unauthenticated requests, the rate limit allows you to make up to 5 requests per minute before you get denied access. And then you will just have to wait for a minute, and then that limit will reset. And so often when you're first testing, you do have to make a lot of requests in order to determine the best way to grab and then analyze the data, which is why registering is generally the preferred method. But we're not going to register though, because it does add complexity to the code, and well, we don't have enough time in this actual session to do that. And there's plenty of other benefits from registering as well, so that's not the only benefit. So we want to actually search by users. And this shows you, this documentation shows you how to structure the actual request. And this example is really quite intuitive down here. So the endpoint that we are hitting is just /search/users. And then we add in search terms to the URL query parameter. So let's say, for example, that we want to search by location. So we can just grab this URL here, and I'll just paste it in here. So I actually already have this saved in here, it looks like. So if we want to query by location, actually that's not right. So it's going to be Q equals location bowler. And let's say we want to limit that just to users that say primarily code in Python. Well, you can just add a plus on the end here, and then we can add language, and I actually already have this saved. And so there's our data. So we are making a GET request to this endpoint here, adding in these query parameters, and this returns a JSON response of users. So it's really that easy, at least with the GitHub API. Okay, so with that done, let's turn to some code. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and kill the server. The best way to consume a RESTful API with Python is via the request library. So let's go ahead and install it with pip. So pip install requests. Okay, so pip freeze. There we go. Okay, so let's start by updating the main route in our app.py file. So let's open app.py. Let me zoom in here real quick. Let me just copy this and I'll paste it and I'll comment this out. So let's see what we have going on here. So let me put in some comments here. So these are the user inputs that we are grabbing from the form. And after that, let's make an API call, set a variable of URL, and then let's grab this URL here. Go ahead and paste it in there. This actually needs to be a string. And then we want to convert this to a dictionary. So we can say response stick equals request get URL JSON. And we don't need this anymore. So this JSON method here at the end is actually used to convert the response object to a Python dictionary. And that's really taking the place of this here. Or actually, I'm sorry, just this part here. So let me get rid of this here. And then we can pass the response dict directly into the JSONify function there. Okay, so Linter is screaming at me because we have these defined, but they're not in use, basically. This is over 85 or over 80 characters, and I need to import requests. Okay, so let's turn to the front end now, and we'll make a few changes before we test this out. So open up templates, index.html. How about we start just by, let's just change the title to something a little bit more simple now, since this is going to have different functionality. And now we need to look at the input tags. So we're no longer entering numbers. So let's enter a location. And then enter a programming language. And let's go ahead and change these to match the data that we are getting. So location, and then language. We change this to find me a developer. And we don't need this anymore. Let's just put in a div here. Set the ID equal to results. And don't forget the closing tag there. So really the major changes are to the input tags. So you want to pay attention to these name elements here as we switch over to the JavaScript file. So let's open up the main.js file here. So we want to change value 1 and value 2. We're no longer targeting an input with the name of number 1. This is actually going to be location, and then language. And then let's go ahead and comment out this line here where we're appending the results to the DOM. We'll address that in just a second. Go back to app.py. We can actually uncomment these now. So value 1, value 2. That's fine. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and pass these values into the URL here. So let's change Let's take out location. And of course, let's take out the language here. So this is going to make our app dynamic. So it's not returning the same location and the same language each time. We can pick location and language, and it'll give us different results. So let's use the format method here with the function, and then pass in value 1, and then we can pass in value 2. Let's recap before we test. So on the front end, the user inputs a location and programming language. Then we're grabbing those values in the JavaScript file and then passing them via post request to the backend. And then within this home view function, we grab those values, we're appending them to this URL string and then making the API call. And then once the results are returned, we convert them to a dictionary. And then finally, we're serializing them and returning them back to the front end. So let's go ahead and test this out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run the app. Okay, let me actually jump back to the front end real quick. So let's change the max width on the inputs to 250 pixels. Okay, so now we can see the entire placeholder there. Okay, so how about Seattle? And then Python. And open up your JavaScript console, since we are going to be console.logging the results here. Okay, so please enter a number. Within our index.html file, I still have the type set the number, and HTML5 is testing to make sure a number is inputted, and if a number is not inputted, it's going to throw me an error. So this actually needs to be changed to text. Okay, let's try that again. So Seattle and Python, find me a developer. Okay, so we got an internal server error. Let's see what's going on here. Let's see. Invalid literal for int with base 10. Okay. What that means is we're trying to take that string here and convert it to an integer. And we obviously don't need to do that anymore. We want to keep those as strings. Okay, so Seattle and then Python. Cool. So we can see that we have an object here in the console. And if you open it up, you can see we have an items array, and that items array has 30 different objects in it. And this has the metadata for the GitHub users. Okay, so now we need to parse this data. And to be honest, this is it's a simple yet mundane process where you test, then you find the key that you want. So in this case, looks like we want to parse it down to items. We see the results, and then we test again, and then you continue that process until you have the actual data that you need. And I would highly recommend that if this is a very, very complicated object that you get back, to actually save this and then put it into a different file and then import that file into your app.py and work with it like that. Otherwise, it can be kind of difficult to see what's going on here in the console. But this is actually a pretty simple object that we are getting back, so we can work with it. Okay, so let's start with items, and let's just grab one item. That'll make things a lot simpler. So we're actually parsing it here. So within our main.js, let's just put .items 0. So this is where we are appending to the DOM, and we're targeting the results ID. Or I'm sorry, the tag that has the CSS selector of an ID equal to results. And within there, we are putting this results.total. So that total doesn't exist anymore. That was from the prior iteration of this application. So let's try this. So this should grab this object here. So basically this first object within this array. So let's try it. Let's just test that out real quick. And did I save everything? I did. Okay. Seattle and Python. So you can see this first object here. And you can see it's not getting appended to the DOM. It's because we can't append this object like this to the DOM. We need to parse it more. So why don't we grab, let's see, how about the, what do we have here? How about this HTML URL? So that URL should go, yeah, that's going to be to their actual GitHub profile. So if we do .html URL, let's refresh that, Seattle, Python. Okay, so that's getting appended to the DOM. There's obviously not much we can do with that right now. So how about we make that link clickable? And we will add the, let's see, what's the username? Okay, it's login. All right. So we're going to change this a little bit. So let's put in a little bit of HTML. Okay, and then we want to put in the username here. Okay, I believe this should work. Let me test it out. Let's refresh. So Seattle, Python. Cool. So let's try this. And there we go. Perfect. Okay, what else should we do? How about the avatar? Let's grab the avatar. Okay. So this is going to get a little bit messy, but we will clear this up in a second. So that looks right. Let's test this out again. Refresh this. Seattle, Python. There it is. Awesome. So there's obviously plenty more that we can do here to make this look much nicer. However, we're going to go ahead and stop here. Is next time we're going to add Angular to make handling this data in the front end much easier. Another thing that's going on is we're not handling errors at all. So think about what happens if the search returns no results. So let's see, what could we type in here? South Korea, I don't know, can't think of anything, Ruby. So if there are no results, and let's see what's going on in the JavaScript console. Yeah, so we're getting this cannot read property HTML URL of undefined. So we're trying to parse this, but nothing gets returned, so it can't find anything. And the real issue is for the end user, because the end user sees nothing happening. So we'll have to fix this as well. So that's going to be it for today. And hopefully you were able to follow along and at least get the basic understanding of first how to consume data from an external RESTful API, and then how to parse that data. So I would highly recommend playing around with this app at this point. Parse some more data from the JSON objects and append it to the DOM. Make it look nice. See if you can mimic what's going on here. Grab all this stuff here and append it to the DOM. And if you do that, go ahead and send me your code and I'll do a quick code review. And again, my email is info@realpython.com. Let's go ahead and kill the server. And as always, we want to commit the code. So git add -a and git commit, added GitHub API. And then go ahead and push to your GitHub repo if you have it set up. And then, of course, when done, go ahead and deactivate your virtual environment. Okay, so next time we're going to be looking at Angular. And so we're going to remove all that JavaScript code that we worked on. And also be sure before the question to at least skim over this Angular intro tutorial that I put together. And I'll actually share my screen again. That'll make it easier. Let's pull it up real quick. Yeah, this is just a basic introduction to creating a Bitcoin investment calculator, but it goes through the very basics of Angular, and it gives you the sort of Angular terminology that you need. So I would highly recommend going through this before the next session. Otherwise, you will be lost, as I cannot teach all of the basics and syntax in one session. And as you go through this, just try to get the basic understanding or the basic gist of how Angular is working and how it achieves much of the same things that we're doing with jQuery and Ajax, just much differently. And I will explain next time the advantages of learning Angular and why it's really good to be using Angular for this type of application specifically that we are building. Cool. Again, I'll put all these links and stuff into the video's description after I edit it down and take out all the pauses and ums and whatnot. So again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.